continue on here, and we left off with the slippery slope argument, and again, a good way to spot it is if there's the claim that a policy or a situation is going to escalate to an extremely dangerous or unacceptable level, then that's a good sign that that you're dealing with a slippery slope argument. And the point is, you're saying that the causal situation is such that if you even begin in a certain direction, that things will lead inevitably down the hill toward an unacceptable situation.
Is that similar to that?
Pardon?
Is that similar? Is this like? Well, I mean, not exactly, but it's like, is this like the way I describe like the slippery slope is that you say something, and then like as you build your argument, it just gets like farther and further away from what you're initially saying?
No, that might be something like bringing a red herring or missing the point. No, but in the slippery slope fallacy, you're arguing that once you start on a given, say, policy situation, like if we legalize marijuana for medical purposes, that's going to end up ultimately in the legalization of marijuana across the board. Or if we once banned Saturday night specials, which happened a long time ago. That was the type of gun that President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, was killed with, a cheap .22 that, when I was a teenager, you could buy mail order, no questions asked, and they called them cheap Saturday night specials. They were easy to get a hold of. Nobody could track them, and a lot of criminals were using these types of firearms to commit crimes, and so they banned them. You don't open a comic book anymore and see an ad where you can buy a real gun for next to nothing, just mail order, no questions asked, because that kind of thing's illegal nowadays. But nonetheless, there were slippery slope arguments at the time that said, well, if we start banning Saturday night specials, this is just the first step down a slippery slope that's going to take us ultimately to the confiscation of all firearms and making all firearms illegal for private citizens. And the question is, it's a fallacy because you don't really have enough evidence to make the claim that things are going to progress, down the road to the conclusion you want, right? And so slippery slope arguments, you're kind of saying there's a whole succession of events that's going to be inevitable from the mere fact that that the first step occurs, that one event occurs. Okay, well, we already discussed that. An analogy, we saw that there can be good arguments from analogy. In an analogy, you say that two things are alike in certain respects, and that's your premise, that A and B are alike in certain respects, A, B, and C. Your author phrases it a little differently, but it's the same as what I'm telling you. Therefore, there's some further respect in which we should view them to be analogous or similar, and that's your conclusion. And as David Hume pointed out, if we were to examine cadavers and say that, blood flows in your veins much like it does in the veins of this cadaver that we're examining on the medical table, well, we'd have a pretty strong argument from analogy. If we even had an animal, you know, a fetal pig or a cat like we used to use in biology, and he said, well, blood flows in the human circulatory system much like it does in this animal that we're dissecting. Well, it's an argument from analogy, and it's a little bit weaker than the first, but still there are a lot of similarities between our anatomy and the anatomy of an animal. But if you saw veins in a plant that the sap flows through, and you would say, well, here is what looks like little tubules, and they're similar to veins, so it must be that sap circulates continuously in plants, much the way that blood does in the veins of a human being. Well, that would be a bad analogy. It would be taking one similarity and basically, without enough evidence, drawing to a conclusion that's, as a matter of fact, false. I mean, if you've taken biology yet, you might know that one of the reasons why the leaves turn in the fall is that the sap goes down to the roots, and among it, you know, the chlorophyll goes out of the leaves, leaving xanthophyll and carotene. Well, carotene colors leaves orange, and xanthophyll colors them yellow. See, I was awake in biology class that day. And, you know, and so the chlorophyll, which colors them green, is down. But the point is, the sap doesn't circulate. In the fall, it goes back down to the roots of the tree or the plant, but it doesn't circulate, and so it would be a weak analogy. This was something that the philosopher David Hume pointed out when he was trying to illustrate the difference between a weak analogy and a good analogy. So the fallacy of weak analogy then basically occurs when we have some similarities that aren't enough to really establish that the additional similarity we're claiming really holds. And especially if there are similarities that don't really relate to whether something has the additional characteristic. So again, your book phrases this just slightly differently as far as the structure of an analogy, but it's pretty much this. You're saying that A and B are alike in certain respects. They're alike in possessing characteristic A, characteristic B, maybe characteristic C as well. And so those are the premises of your argument from analogy, and you want somebody to conclude that because A and B are alike in these respects, that there's a further respect, you know, that they're also alike in. And so, but you commit this fallacy if, at least one significant way to commit it is if possessing the similarities that you cite in your premises really have nothing to do with whether something has the additional attribute that you're arguing for. You can, you know, come up with a false argument from analogy. There are, believe it or not, similarities between the way electricity flows in a wire and the way water flows in a pipe. Now most people just don't set up the huge kind of stereo systems people used to be fond about, But it really is true that just as a larger pipe can carry more water, more liquid in it, in a given time frame, it really is true that a larger wire can carry more current without it overheating. I mean, one of the things that you'll see in a fuse is that the part of the fuse that will actually burn out if you put too much current through it is very thin, because the fuse makers want to be sure that if you put more than 10 amps through this automobile fuse because something shorted or whatever, that it'll blow. So they take a thin filament that won't take more current. But audiophiles know that if you want to have a quick response from an amplifier to crescendos, going from a really low sound to a really loud sound, you can accomplish that better if you have a larger speaker wire. We used to get this cable that was really thick. It was about 12, no, it was more than 12 gauge. It was huge. They used to call it monster cable. I think they still sell it. To run on the speakers. So there are some analogies between electricity in a wire and gravity in a pipe, and water flow in a pipe. But here's a factor that is not affected. Whether gravity affects the flow of water in a pipe, and it does, it has nothing to do with the flow of electricity in a wire. So you can't conclude then that electricity is going to flow better if you make it flow downhill, right? So it would be wrong to conclude that the flow of electricity in a wire is affected by gravity, much like the flow of water through a pipe, right? So while there are some similarities, there are significant differences. And so if you focus on a feature that has nothing to do with other characteristics like gravity, you can come up with a false analogy. So this is kind of, this was one of Hurley's illustrations. And I already mentioned an illustration given by David Hume, that it would be a bad analogy to conclude from the fact that there are some similarities between the tubules in a plant that carry sap and the veins that we have in our bodies that carry blood. It would be wrong to conclude from those superficial similarities that blood circulates in plants continuously, much like it does in humans and non-human animals. That would be a false analogy. So these are a little harder to spot, but it's one fallacy, and so what you're trying to do is to draw a similarity where there really isn't one, and where the previous similarities that you mentioned have nothing to do. In other words, the width of a wire and the width of a pipe do have something to do with how much water or how much current will flow through it, but gravity is irrelevant. In other words, that a wire is larger, it doesn't mean that gravity is going to somehow affect electric flow. So that would be a wrong similarity to point out. So that's the end of the inductive arguments. The fallacies of weak induction. Let me just pause this. start this before. Fallacies of presumption. When we reason in real life, many times we do not state every single premise that we're using in our argument in a very explicit way. In the way you would state a proof in geometry where you're showing every step. Or in the way that we summarize arguments in logic. Very often when we're arguing with somebody, there may be a premise that we're not explicitly stating, but we're assuming it. Well, that can be legitimate, okay? It can be legitimate to have an assumed premise, but where fallacies of presumption occur is when something is assumed by an arguer that they really don't have a right to logically. In other words, where an unstated premise masks a presumption made by the arguer that the arguer really doesn't have a clear right to make. So in this class of fallacies, what they all have in common is that there's something unstated going on. The arguer assumes a premise that they don't have any right to. So one commits these fallacies when one makes an unjustified assumption and then proceeds to draw a conclusion on the basis of it, or on the basis of it with maybe a few other premises. Often the unjustified assumption is unstated and hidden, thus it must be brought out in analysis. In other words, sometimes part of analyzing an argument, especially when in ordinary language, is trying to determine from context whether there is at least one unstated premise going on that the argument needs. And now sometimes this can be legitimate and sometimes not. So evaluating fallacies of presumption is a little more challenging because you're often looking for something that, from understanding the context, that the arguer is assuming but not stating. Now, one type of argument is called begging the question, where the question has to do with focusing on an unstated opinion. This is the way Kobe puts it. Very often, why do we reason in the first place? Why do we develop arguments? Why not just flatly state what we believe? Why bother reasoning to a conclusion? Why not just state the conclusion as fact and go on? Well, usually, when we're reasoning with somebody, we're trying to take that person from statements that they would accept, that they would be willing to say, okay, I'll go along with that, I'll agree to that, to a conclusion that they're not as likely to accept without some evidential support in the form of an argument given. But the problem with the circular argument is you basically assume what you're supposed to be proving. In other words, that the premises are just as controversial as the conclusion. So you're not taking somebody from, statements they would be willing to accept to a conclusion or not. But you're essentially assuming what you're supposed to be proving. And so one way is that they call this reasoning in a circle. In other words, your premises, if true, just include your conclusion. Sometimes in different words. Now, begging the question or a circular argument, or now you get the Latin Petitio Principii. They all mean the same thing. Request for the source, they give you the translation. Now, he says that the word begging the question comes from the fact that after reading or hearing the argument, the observer is inclined to ask, but how do you know that X? In other words, X may be just as hard to prove as the conclusion. What time is it?
136.
Oh, okay. I ran out and forgot my cell phone. It's not wearing watches. I should start wearing one again. If I forget my cell phone, that's how I tell time, right? Along with the position of the sky. The position of the sun of the sky. Like, I'm going to be skeptical about that. I'll believe he tells time by his cell phone, but not by the position of the sky in the afternoon. Okay, so you have a little diagram here where they illustrate some of the ways a circular argument can happen, and they run from fairly simple ways to some involved complex ways. So the first, you assume a key premise, but you're essentially assuming the conclusion of the argument. The second one, and I have an example of that, is where in the conclusion you actually restate the premise in different words. And the third one is what's sometimes called vicious circularity, an argument that's more involved and that has several steps, but where the last step kind of puts you back at the beginning, and so the whole thing goes in a big circle. You get a good example of the first kind where a shaky premise is missing. Murder is morally wrong. This being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong. Well, that argument assumes what? it assumes the hidden premise that abortion is murder. And, you know, so it begs the question, well, how do you know that all cases of abortion are cases of murder? You know, and so, now, I mean, you can argue for the moral impermissibility of abortion, but it takes more than just this. So, you see, what's going on here is a hidden premise. We know that humans are intended to eat lots of fruit because the human hand and arm are perfectly suited for picking fruit from a tree. Well, begs the question, well, how do you know that those similarities, you know, that because the human hand is shaped the way it is? You know, I mean, I can also argue that the human hand is perfectly suitable, you know, to hold a Hershey bar. Therefore, we were intended to eat plenty of Hershey bars during our life. You know. So, in other words, you have an assumption kind of built in there, right? So, begging the question then, at the bottom, in that last page, the first of these arguments begs or invites the question, how do you know that abortion is a form of murder? In other words, that is assumed as a hidden premise in the argument. In other words, the argument in one is something like this: murder is morally wrong. Abortion is always a form of murder. Therefore, abortion is morally wrong. You know, and so somebody could say, well, okay, there's a premise that you're building into your argument, but what's your support for that premise? You know, and obviously there are various answers that can be given. That I know from having discussed abortion in ethics classes and reading essays on it, it can get to be rather complicated. But this is an example then of somebody building in a premise and just simply assuming something with that they ought to be arguing for. And so obviously, you know, you can challenge the argument from the point of view that, well, you haven't established that all types of abortion are forms of murder. What's your support for that premise? And a more complex reasoning, and this is what happens in books or long articles. You might have a main argument with a set of premises going on, but part of what you're also doing is providing additional evidential support for the premises that you're using. In other words, if somebody gave this argument, murder is morally wrong, this being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong, and then goes on to say, now some of you might be wondering as to why I consider all cases of abortion to be murder. Well, here is my support for that, you know, and you could give something like the biological criterion, that anything that's biologically a human being, you know, or you know, or capable of developing into a human being. You know, I mean, there are various ways, but But this person commits a fallacy because they're not providing evidential support for the unstated premise that abortion is murder. They're just assuming it's true. See, that's why we call it a fallacy. That's why it fits into the category of fallacies of presumption. This person is presuming that all cases of abortion are cases of murder without providing any evidential support for that assumed premise. And that's why it's considered a fallacy. Well, so a circular argument then assumes what's supposed to be proven, or that we're using premises that are as doubtful and as controversial as the conclusion. I mean, think about it. The unstated premise that all cases of abortion are murder is as controversial as the conclusion that they're trying to prove there. So, I mean, here's one example. Miracles cannot happen because they would violate the laws of nature, and nothing can violate the laws of nature. Well, here what's assumed is that the laws of nature are so rigid that even the Almighty could not violate them. But of course, for some people, what's at stake in the philosophical debate over whether or not we can rationally justify that a miracle happened is whether, if God is the author of the laws of nature, that God can break those laws. So what's at stake in the debate over whether miracles can occur is whether the laws of nature, as they normally occur, can be violated. And in assuming that there's no way that they can be, the arguer basically begs the question. Well, this is one that we're going to look at next time, and it's illustrated in this dialogue box, in the little box on page 157, by the second type, where basically the conclusion simply restates the premise in different words. So it looks like you're establishing something different, but you're really just saying the same thing, in different words. Okay, again, the homework's due Monday, not Friday. And so we'll see you Friday and have a Thanks a lot.